In this episode, we do a full end-to-end integrated review by walking one realistic use case all the way through governance, program flow, lifecycle management, and control decisions. The purpose is not to introduce new terminology, but to help you feel how the concepts interlock when the story is continuous, because the exam often tests whether you can connect decisions across time. When you can trace how a single use case moves from an idea to a live system, and then through change and incident handling, you stop thinking in isolated definitions and start thinking in risk sequences. We will pick one common use case that is easy to imagine: a customer support assistant that drafts responses for agents using organizational knowledge. This kind of system is valuable, but it sits at the intersection of content risk, brand risk, leakage risk, and human over-reliance, so it creates exactly the kinds of trade-offs AAIR questions like to explore. As you listen, keep asking yourself what should happen next at each stage, because that is how you practice exam judgment. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The story begins before any tool is chosen, because governance should shape the use case from the first moment someone proposes it. The proposal is simple. Support agents spend time rewriting answers, searching knowledge bases, and responding repeatedly to similar questions, so a generative assistant could improve speed and consistency. Governance does not respond by asking for a long technical report. It responds by asking for a clear purpose, clear scope, and a clear view of who could be harmed if the assistant behaves badly. A key early governance decision is whether the assistant is only drafting or whether it will be allowed to send messages automatically, because that boundary changes exposure dramatically. Another governance decision is whether the assistant will have access to customer data, internal incident notes, or confidential documents, because that changes leakage risk and privacy obligations. Governance also needs to identify accountability early, meaning who owns the use case, who owns the risk posture, and who can authorize constraints if risk rises. These decisions are how governance drives safe design, because they set boundaries before teams invest deeply in a risky direction. Once governance boundaries exist, the program begins, and the program's job is to turn that early intent into repeatable steps that can be applied consistently. The intake process captures the purpose, the users, the data types involved, and the nature of outputs, especially whether any output could be interpreted as a promise to a customer. Risk tiering then sorts the use case, and for a customer support assistant, a reasonable tier is not the lowest one because the system is customer-facing and can affect trust quickly. That tiering triggers a set of baseline controls from a control library, such as requiring human review before sending messages, restricting the assistant's access to sensitive internal notes, and requiring monitoring for harmful output categories. The program also determines what evidence is required before launch, such as a validation summary that shows the assistant behaves acceptably in common scenarios and that major failure modes have been considered. Importantly, the program makes the workflow predictable, so the team knows what steps are required and does not feel surprised by late-stage gatekeeping. Predictability is how programs avoid both chaos and shadow work. Now move into lifecycle thinking at the pre-deployment stage, because this is where many systems either become safer by design or become difficult to fix later. Before deployment, the team needs to define what the assistant is allowed to do and what it must not do, using plain rules that match support realities. For example, if the assistant drafts replies, it should avoid generating commitments about refunds, legal terms, or sensitive account actions unless those statements are pulled from approved templates. Another key pre-deployment step is deciding what knowledge sources the assistant can use, because allowing it to read everything increases risk of leakage and of including outdated or incorrect information. A safer approach often starts with a limited, curated set of documents that are already intended for customer-facing guidance, and then expands cautiously as monitoring proves stability. Pre-deployment also includes defining the human workflow, meaning the agent must review, edit, and verify before sending, and that expectation must be supported by interface design and training. Lifecycle discipline here is not about perfection, It is about ensuring that basic boundaries and monitoring exist from day one of exposure. With boundaries defined, validation becomes the next stage, and validation should be thought of as a decision readiness check rather than as a scientific proof. The team should test whether the assistant can handle the most common question categories accurately, whether it stays within the tone and policy expectations, and whether it tries to invent answers when it does not know. Validation also examines failure modes, such as whether the assistant can produce sensitive information, whether it can be manipulated into revealing internal data, and whether it can produce harmful or biased content under certain prompts. Because this is a drafting tool, validation also includes the human factor. Do agents understand that the output is a draft and not a fact source? And do they feel pressure to send quickly without review? A common beginner mistake is assuming validation is only a model quality task. But in risk governance, validation also includes workflow validation, meaning you test whether controls like review are actually feasible under real-time pressure. If review takes too long or is unclear, agents will bypass it, so validation must include realistic use and feedback. Now the system launches in a constrained way, because constrained rollout is one of the safest patterns when uncertainty exists. Instead of launching to all agents immediately, the program might require a limited group of trained agents and a limited set of customer question categories, so exposure is controlled. The human review requirement is enforced as a workflow boundary, meaning the assistant cannot send messages directly, and the organization treats the agent as accountable for the final output. Monitoring begins on day one, focusing on signals that map to harm, such as flagged outputs for incorrect policy claims, tone problems, sensitive data inclusion, and repeated agent overrides. These monitoring signals are tied to thresholds, so the organization knows when to act rather than simply watch charts. For example, a threshold might trigger a review when a certain category of unsafe output appears, or when agents report a specific failure pattern more than a certain number of times. This stage illustrates how lifecycle thinking makes governance real. You are not just hoping the system behaves. You are watching and ready to constrain further if needed. As the assistant runs, the program must manage both technical signals and human behavior signals, because human behavior can amplify or dampen risk. If agents begin to rely on the assistant as a source of truth and stop checking policy, that is a risk signal even if outputs look mostly fine. If agents begin pasting sensitive customer details into prompts to get better drafts, that is a leakage risk signal and a policy signal. A mature program responds by improving safe workflows, such as providing a safer way to reference account context without exposing unnecessary details, rather than only reminding agents to be careful. It also ensures that supervisors and team leads understand their role in reinforcing review discipline, because cultural pressure can either protect the control or erode it. Monitoring also watches for drift, such as a slow increase in incorrect answers over time, which could indicate that the knowledge base is outdated or that the assistant is being used in new question categories that were not validated. In this phase, the system is not only monitored, it is governed, meaning signals lead to decisions. Now imagine an incident occurs, because incidents are where integration is tested. Suppose a customer posts a screenshot showing the assistant drafted a response that included internal incident notes and implied a promise that was not true. The first priority is harm containment, meaning you stop the system from producing similar exposures while you investigate. Containment might include restricting access to certain knowledge sources, pausing the assistant for the affected category of requests, or requiring additional review steps for a period. At the same time, the response must preserve evidence, meaning logs and decision records are captured so the organization can reconstruct what happened. A cross-functional playbook becomes critical here because communications, privacy, legal, product, and support leadership must coordinate quickly. The message to the public must be truthful and focused on actions being taken, without overpromising perfection. This is where governance shows its value, because clear decision rights prevent delays, and clear accountability prevents finger-pointing that slows containment. Investigation then follows containment. An investigation must be broad enough to include system behavior, data access, and human workflows. The team needs to confirm whether internal notes were accessible because of a misconfigured data connection, because of overly broad permissions, or because an agent pasted sensitive notes into a prompt. The difference matters because it changes which controls should be strengthened. If the system had direct access to internal incident notes, the control failure is primarily about data governance and access boundaries, and the corrective action might include stricter data classification enforcement and curated knowledge sources. If the leakage occurred because agents pasted sensitive information, the control failure might be about training, workflow design, and lack of safe alternatives that meet agent needs. Investigation also examines why the assistant implied a promise, because that touches brand and legal risk, and it may lead to adding safer templates or stronger constraints on generating certain kinds of statements. A mature investigation produces a clear timeline, a clear root cause hypothesis, and a clear plan to prevent recurrence, rather than a vague statement that the model behaved unexpectedly. Recovery is the stage where the organization decides how to restore safe operations without pretending nothing happened. Recovery might include re-enabling the assistant only after certain safeguards are in place, such as removing access to sensitive knowledge sources, strengthening prompt handling boundaries, and improving monitoring thresholds. Recovery also includes supporting affected individuals, such as correcting misinformation and addressing any privacy concerns if personal data was involved. The organization may also need to communicate updates to leadership, partners, or regulators depending on the severity of the incident. Importantly, recovery criteria should be explicit, so teams do not rush to restore full function under pressure or remain paused indefinitely, because nobody agrees on what safe enough means. This is where residual risk acceptance becomes visible, because leadership may decide to proceed with constraints, accept certain risks, and invest in improvements over time. Recovery should therefore be documented as a decision, not a return to business as usual by inertia. After the incident stabilizes, the program should convert learning into durable improvement, because the point of governance is not to survive one event, but to become safer over time. This is where controls are updated in the control library, policy guidance is clarified, training is refined with real examples, and monitoring signals are adjusted to catch similar patterns earlier. The organization may also update intake questions so future projects are forced to consider the same risk driver early, such as knowledge source access and the difference between customer-facing drafts and commitments. If the incident revealed a cultural issue, like agents feeling pressured to send drafts without checking, leaders may adjust incentives and expectations so review is supported rather than punished. The playbook itself may be updated to clarify who makes containment decisions and how communications are approved. This is the continuous improvement loop that the exam wants you to value, because it demonstrates maturity and defensibility. Without this loop, the organization repeats the same failure and loses trust faster each time. Now consider what happens when the use case evolves, because lifecycle governance must handle expansion without letting risk creep silently. The business might want the assistant to handle more complex issues, to access more internal data, or to automate certain responses for speed. Each expansion is a change event that should trigger reassessment, because the risk profile changes as exposure increases. Governance should require a clear justification for expansion, a review of whether controls remain sufficient, and evidence that monitoring will catch new failure modes. The program should enforce this through change management steps, not through informal approvals. Controls might also need to be strengthened, such as adding specialized review for certain categories or tightening boundaries on what the assistant can say in sensitive situations. A key exam insight is that many failures happen not at initial launch, but at expansion, because the system drifts into higher stakes use without upgraded controls. Lifecycle discipline prevents that by treating change as a moment of risk, not just a moment of progress. To integrate everything, notice how the same concepts appeared repeatedly in different forms throughout the use case. Governance defined purpose, boundaries, decision rights, and accountability, which shaped what the team was allowed to build and how quickly it could expand. The program provided intake, tiering, control selection, evidence requirements, monitoring routines, and incident pathways, which turned governance into consistent behavior. Lifecycle thinking ensured that validation happened before exposure, monitoring happened during exposure, and reassessment happened during change and after incidents. Controls were then chosen and adjusted based on risk drivers, with a focus on practical boundaries, human accountability, and measurable effectiveness. The incident tested whether these pieces were real, and the recovery and learning phases showed whether the organization could improve rather than deny. This is the full system the exam wants you to reason about, because AI risk is not solved by one control, it is managed by an aligned system. As we close, this end-to-end walkthrough is meant to make the AAIR mental model feel like a story you can replay in your mind when you face scenario questions. Start with governance, because governance decides who can act and what boundaries exist. Move to program, because program determines whether decisions are executed consistently and whether controls are practical rather than checkbox. Apply lifecycle thinking, because AI risk changes over time, and monitoring, change management, and incident readiness are what keep the organization in control. Choose controls as the tools that reduce the most plausible harm pathways, especially those involving customer trust, sensitive information, and over-reliance in decisioning. When incidents occur, contain harm first, preserve evidence, coordinate cross-functional response, and then convert learning into stronger controls and clearer processes. If you can reason through one use case this way, you can reason through almost any exam scenario, because the themes repeat even when the details change. That is what it means to think like a risk leader from end to end.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.